What's up guys, how you doing? Welcome to another video, and today we're talking about the Canon R7. That's right, my series that I've been promising you guys for ages about the Canon R7 is here. Well look, I've been testing out the Canon R7 fairly extensively, and of course I've mostly been using it for sports. So today we're going to talk about how you set up this camera for sports, the way in which I've set it up to shoot the sports that I have with this camera, the way I've kind of set up and configured the buttons, the actual settings that I use, and what I think you need to do to get the best from it to shoot sports. Before we get into it, I'm going to ask you guys to do all the usual YouTube stuff for me. Make sure you hit the like button, make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. Comment below, let me know what you think of the Canon R7, and please feel free to share opinions, including those opinions that are different from my own. I'm totally cool with people disagreeing with me. You might have found something about this camera that I haven't picked up on yet, so let us know in the comments below. Right, let's get into this. So first of all, a couple of kind of, I guess, sort of physical bits, like how have I set up the camera? Well, first thing to note, I'm just going to touch on memory cards. You get the two memory card slots with the Canon R7. They're both SD cards that you can fit in there. Make sure you've got yourself some fast cards. You want some cards that are going to process your images quick enough to keep up with this camera. Really, really important that you do that. Sometimes with sports cameras, or when people are shooting sports, they're firing off bursts of shots and they're thinking, oh, you know, this camera's really slow. So often it's not the camera at all, it's the memory card. So make sure you got yourself some fast memory cards before you start shooting sports. Okay, next up, what about the buttons? How have I set myself up to shoot the sports? Well, you guys will know if you've watched my channel for any kind of length of time at all that I like to shoot with back button focus. So with that in mind, I have got my AF button on the back set up to be my focus button, and I have disassociated the shutter button from the focus. Taking shots with the shutter button, I'm focusing with the AF on button at the back. You can do that in the menu, you can go in and you can customize the buttons. Okay, what about the other buttons and the dials? Well, the R7 is a little bit different. If you guys are familiar with shooting with like the R6 or the R5, the setup on the back is slightly different. First of all, you've got this kind of like cross button situation, and then you have a dial and a joystick up at the top. Slightly different setup from the R6, for example. Well, I'll tell you how I've got it set up. Quite simply, the dial on the top by the shutter button is doing my shutter speed. The dial on the back here by the thumb, that's doing my aperture. For ISO, which is of course our third variable in our exposure triangle, you get the cool ISO button on the R7, just like you do with like the 1DX, for example. So I hit the ISO button, and then this dial here changes from being the shutter speed to the ISO. So I'm shutter speed or ISO if I hit the ISO button, and then aperture with this dial on the back. That's how I've set up my dials and focus on back button focus. Everything else physically with the camera is pretty much the same. It takes you a little while to get used to it. Certainly when I started shooting with it, I was reaching for buttons like where they are on my R6 and trying to find a joystick down here when it's slightly higher up on the top. But you know what? I found that my muscle memory got used to it really, really quick. For some reason, it's fairly intuitive, and actually probably quicker than I have any other camera. I found myself just automatically going to the relevant buttons without having to search for them. I found that happened really, really quick with the R7. So that's how we're setting the camera up physically. I wasn't going to touch on actual settings, but just briefly I will. Of course, if you're shooting sports, you want to be shooting with a fast shutter speed. So generally speaking, I'm going to have my shutter speed somewhere around 1,000th of a second. If it's a little darker, you might drop to 1/800th. If it's a bright sunny day, you go up to 1,600, whatever you can get to. Fast shutter speed. Aperture, I'm going as low as my lens will allow. So for example, I've predominantly been using the 2470 RF 2.8. So I've been setting my aperture at f2.8. That enables me to get my shutter speed faster without having to go too high on the ISO levels. Now, seeing as I've just mentioned ISO levels, let's address the elephant in the room. You guys are going to be wanting to know all about the ISO performance of this camera. Well, I might touch on that in today's video, but that is going to come in a whole separate video of its own. We're going to talk all about low light performance, and don't worry, I have tested it extensively. Okay, so what about a few of the other settings in this camera? Well, first of all, let's just touch on autofocus. So I've got the camera set up in the continuous focus mode, the AI servo mode for Canon shooters. I find that combined with the back button focus is enabling me to get the best out of this Canon R7. Now, sticking with autofocus, the R7 of course has some really fantastic tracking modes, but I have actually turned off the tracking mode for the R7 when I'm shooting sports. I like to use the single point center point autofocus. Now, there'll be people who disagree with me with this, and with some sports you can shoot it when you're using things like subject tracking or facial tracking. I find with sports that even with the top cameras like the R3, that will struggle to keep up with some sporting situations. So I've got that turned off, and instead I'm using the single center point autofocus because I find that just works best for sports. I've got it sent to the center point and then I can track the subject that I'm shooting. So that's how I've got the autofocus set up. You guys might touch on the case options where you can choose the different cases. This has like an auto case function where you let it kind of choose the case for you. I actually haven't used that. I've just got it set to case 1. I use case 1 on my R6. I find it just works the best for the majority of sports that I shoot. So that's how I have all the autofocus set up for my Canon R7. Okay, what about the shutter? Because of course, if you shoot electronic shutter with this Canon R7, you get a crazy fast 30 frames per second. If you're shooting the mechanical shutter, you still get 15 frames per second, which is rapid, but bearing in mind if you're using the adapter and some older EF lenses, it won't reach quite the 15 frames per second mark. You still get pretty quick lens speeds with it, shutter speeds rather, but you won't quite reach the 15 frames per second if you have got it on a really old lens. So why don't you just use the electronic shutter? Well, the problem is for some sports, you will struggle a little bit with the electronic shutter with an effect called rolling shutter. That's where you can get images that are slightly distorted in faster moving subjects. So just to give you an example, this photo right here is a basketball photo I took the other day. That ball is on the way to the ground and I shot this with the electronic shutter. See how the ball is that slightly funny kind of distorted shape? Well, that's the effect of rolling shutter. So with that in mind, for the majority of sports that I'm shooting, I'm going to be using the mechanical shutter on my Canon R7. Okay, and let's just touch the ISO performance. The ISO low light performance in this Canon R7 is surprisingly good. Spoiler alert for my upcoming video on low light performance for this camera. However, it is not as good and is never going to be as good as some of those full frame cameras. For example, it is not as good as my Canon R6. So with that in mind, I don't use auto ISO. I use auto ISO a lot with my 1DX and my Canon R6 because I can trust it. Even if it jumps up to 8,000, 10,000 ISO, the images are going to be okay. Whereas with this, you can shoot it up to some pretty high ISO numbers, and I don't want to spoil my future video too much, but because I don't want it jumping to any old number, I'm not using auto ISO. Instead, I am manually setting my ISO, so I know the limits it's going to be. If my images are coming out too dark or too light, of course I can adjust it as I go. I'm shooting in manual mode, as I always do for shooting sports, but that just gives me the most control over that ISO level, so it's not creeping too high automatically without me realizing it's happened. And I think the last setting we're going to touch on is just the file type, the images. Well, you can shoot RAW, of course, with sports, and there's plenty of circumstances where I would. But if I'm just shooting sports and then sending off the images for, newspaper use, social media, I'm pretty much always shooting in JPEG. I do that because the images are quicker to process, they're quicker to work with, they're quicker to preview on my laptop, and that's why I shoot JPEG for sports. I do that all the time, and so I'm doing that with my Canon R7 as well. So there you go. I think that gives you a bit of a rundown on the best way to set up your Canon R7 to shoot sports. It doesn't mean it's the only way to do it. Other people might have a different opinion on that. At the end of this video, I'm going to include a couple of photos that I've shot so far using the R7, but we're going to be talking loads more about what it's like to shoot sports with this camera in the next video in this series. So make sure you stick around for that one if you want to see loads of images that were taken with this camera. If you enjoyed this one or you're excited for the R7 series, hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you guys on the next video.